Classical and Byzantine History at Tulane University in New Orleans, where he teaches courses in Greek, Roman, Byzantine, and Crusader history. He earned his BA from Trinity College and his master's and PhD from Yale University. Recognized as an outstanding lecturer, Professor Harl has earned, among other awards, Tulane's annual Student Body Award for Excellence in Teaching 9 times. He is also a member in the Board of Trustees of the American Numismatic Society. He has published a wide variety of articles and books, including his current work on coins unearthed in an excavation of Gordion in Turkey, and a new book on Rome and her Iranian foes. So I'm very privileged to introduce Professor Harl, and without further ado, let me give you the floor. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much, most honorable consul. I've published on one of Alexander's great battles at the Granicus. I'm dealing with coins coming out of the excavation of Gordion, where he untied the Gordian knot. Those coins are our best context, the best archaeological context of Hellenistic coins that have come out of Asia Minor. And it's extremely important in illustrating the impact of the conquest of Alexander on the monetization of markets and the development of cities in the wake of his conquests. That's why I accepted the commission. I usually work more in the Roman period. I've also done a DVD course with the teaching company on Alexander the Great, so you can see where my opinion is, and you can bring criticisms whenever you wish. What I want to do today, or tonight, is to review different perceptions of Alexander. And this has come up with conversations with colleagues, some of them dear friends, one of them who insisted that he be demoted to Alexander III, King of Macedon, and the title of Alexander the Great should be dropped. And that got me started. We've discussed some of this in my seminar over the last few weeks. And so what I'm going to convey to you is some impressions of Alexander's career, the popular perceptions that have persisted about him down to this day, and then what is the current scholarly issue about taking away that title great and simply giving him a number, and what would be the arguments for that. And there are, I think, 4 major points I'd like to make, and then sum up, and you can see where my position is on this. So this, of course, is from the famous mosaic from Pompeii, showing Alexander at the climactic moment of charging at the Battle of Issus, a battlefield I've walked a number of times. The battlefield is not changed that significantly. You can follow topography, and it is clearly based on a contemporary painting. It is of the Roman date, but it's a contemporary painting, perhaps by Lysippus, and renders a very accurate image of what the young conqueror was like. Much of it is damaged, and you have to reconstruct part of it. The rest of the mosaic shows King Darius in fear, ready to flee the battlefield. Well, let me start. Alexander the Great was the son of Philip of Macedon and Olympias. He's a member of the Argead family that had ruled Macedonia from very early in the Iron Age, and we have learned a great deal about the development of the monarchy and Macedon due to the Greek excavations since the 1970s, the most spectacular, those at Vergina, that's uncovered royal tombs. Philip and Olympias, both are brilliant in their own way. They're also probably a bit crazy. It was a very tempestuous marriage, and one wonders how Alexander at times could cope with this, such powerful personalities. He himself came very strongly under the influence of his mother, but he had strong feelings with his father, and his father absolutely insisted that this was his heir. There was never a question, I believe, in Philip's mind that this son would follow him. And he would go on to one of the most extraordinary careers in history. And it perhaps is useful for a moment just think about some of the statistics of what he did. He came to the throne at about age 20 or 21. He secured his base in Greece within 18 months, and in 334 BC, he invaded the Persian Empire. This is an extraordinary event. It's often lost in many a textbook and in many popular works, but the campaigns of Alexander, within 6 years, he overthrew the Persian Empire. Now, this is an empire that had ruled the Near East for 250 years, a great bureaucratic state that had rested upon traditions going back some 15 centuries to Babylon, Sumer, the great kings and conquerors of the early Near East. And the Persians were admired by the Greeks as tolerant and effective masters of this great empire. If you look at the statistics by calculation of the Germans in the 19th century, it's some 14,400 miles that was traversed by this army in less than 8 years, which I calculate is about 1,450 miles a year of marching. This is a largely infantry army. It was done on foot. Furthermore, the population of the Persian Empire is estimated to some 40 million, 3,000 miles across, and the total population that acknowledged Alexander either as his king or as the leader of the Hellenic League was probably not more than 2 million. When he invaded, he had an army about 50,000, against which a Persian king could launch armies in the hundreds of thousands. Not all at the same time, but he could replace those armies. Alexander was in debt, 70 talents. I often jest that he had to conquer the world to pay off his creditors. Well, the Persian Empire had 7 times or 10 times that money in treasuries, and unfortunately lost the war too fast to spend it. Alexander, of course, captured it and then turned it into all these neat coins that I tend to study at Gordium. So, and I'm very thankful for him to do that. It's an extraordinary career. And it's a career that has mesmerized and stunned his contemporaries and subsequent generations. And it's led to all sorts of images of him, even in his own lifetime. Now, what I show on the top is a coin issued by Alexander the Great. This would have been at the Greek city of Miletus on the shores of Asia Minor. It shows a young Heracles. And Alexander claimed descent from Heracles and also Achilles. Achilles through his mother, Olympias, who was from the Greek dynasty of the Milesians in Epirus, and his father's family claiming descent from Heracles. These heroes that motivated him, it is still debated whether the image actually portrays the portrait of Alexander or is it the young Heracles. It is clear that later generations identified it with Alexander. This comes through a series of asides. One of the most telling ones is by Constantine Porphyrogenitus, the great Byzantine scholar of the 10th century, the emperor, one of the most likable Byzantine emperors to me, who is reporting early traditions, and the image is closely associated with Alexander. After his death, his successors, his generals, who went on eventually to become kings themselves, at first dare not put their own image on the coins, dare not take the title king, and we have 2 beautiful contemporary images, one by Ptolemy, who eventually took over Egypt. You can see him wearing the elephant headdress, references to the victories in India, which to the Greeks that would be at the end of the world. And then another one by Lysimachus, one of his tough generals, who actually killed a lion in single combat. He's really a tough commander. And this one shows Alexander with the ram's horn, which refers to the god Zeus Amun, that is the Egyptian Greek god at the Oracle of Siwa, which Alexander visited when he was in Egypt. The images persist, and they occur in the Roman age, where there are all sorts of revivals of Alexander on medallions and coins. The one above is really a magnificent piece, and that's in the Walter Art Gallery. It's a great gold medallion that was probably put out for games held in honor of Alexander the Great when the Emperor Severus Alexander, note the name, the Roman emperor is also a little Alexander. Actually, he's not even close, he's a mama's boy. Mom ran him. But these medallions were put out for rewarding victors at games held in celebration. More modest are the bronze coins issued in Macedon under the Roman rule. And notice, they are reviving that silver coin I showed you a moment ago up on top as the portrait of Alexander. The reverse shows Alexander on his horse Bucephalus. Our best image of him, again, coming from a Roman copy of a painting, which I started the lecture on. This is the wall painting, or sorry, the mosaic, which is based on a wall painting in the museum, the Archaeological Museum in Naples, that came out of the excavations of Pompeii. Well, the images of Alexander persisted well beyond the Hellenistic world, the world that he wrought by conquering the Near East. The Romans found Alexander fascinating. They replicated his images. You see it on coins and medallions. You see it here in the mosaic. The Romans themselves were kind of ambiguous about Alex. They are very, very stodgy, aristocratic republicans. And that means the Roman aristocracy as a group believed in collective rule and didn't know what to make of a man of such genius. In fact, in the Roman system, Alexander would be put down. As I often say, and this also applies to academic institutions, when you're dealing with aristocrats, they will forgive you your failures, but never your successes. And so they would often say, well, we have a number of generals. Well, they're not equal to Alexander, but if we add them all up, they are equal to Alexander. That's special pleading. Julius Caesar recognized his genius. There's a famous story that's told to us in several sources, particularly Suetonius, where when he got to Alexandria, where Alexander is buried, that was a great memorial tomb set up by Ptolemy, he was moved to tears. He was in his 50s at the time. And what have I done? And this conqueror had conquered his known world at age 32. And the tour guide said, well, how are you? He said, I am impressed. I am ready to leave. He said, well, what about the tombs of the Ptolemies, the kings who ruled after Alexander in Egypt? And Caesar said, no, I came to see a great king, not a group of corpses. And that was Caesar's dismissal there. But it is telling that, and we have cases of Romans who, in less lucid moments, thought they were Alexander reborn. Those Roman emperors tend to get removed. But the image is powerful. It is communicated to the subject peoples. This is the great sarcophagus that was commissioned by one of the kings of Phoenicia, Sidon, who was put in power by Alexander. It is a Hellenistic style tomb. It was actually done clearly by a Greek artist who had been brought into Phoenicia. And what it has is a marvelous combat scene where you have Alexander in heroic combat sporting the lion's headdress that is featured on his coins, clearly recognized. Here is a subject king trying to associate himself with the power of his great lord. And we also believe on the far right, or my right, your left, the fellow who's turning to move into the center of the lion hunt might well be Hephaestion, who is Alexander's close friend. These images persisted into the early Middle Ages and through the early modern age. Alexander became the fabulous traveler, opening up exotic worlds. This is a great painting from the 17th century showing his entrance in Babylon in heroic triumph. In the Middle Ages, he captured the imagination as a chivalrous conqueror. There were chansons de geste in Old French, celebrating Alexander the way you would celebrate the heroes of Charlemagne. It had penetrated from the French chanson across Europe. And one of the fields I play with as fun is the Viking Age and Norse literature. And I can assure you, even in remote Iceland in the 13th century, there are Icelandic sagas on Alexander the Great, which is the only classical figure that made it into Icelandic Saga. It's really extraordinary that it got to this remote edge of colonial Europe in the 13th century. In the Islamic world, the Persians adopted Alexander after he conquered them. And those of you familiar with Persian literature, the Shahnameh, the great Chronicle of the Kings, which became the epic tradition that was so much embraced by the Islamic world, Alexander, due to his marriages into the royal family of Persia, is turned into essentially a Persian, Iskandar, and his, not really a conquest of Persia, it's really a family dispute. And Darius just happened to lose, which is a nice way of kind of explaining away the fact, how did he overthrow the empire so quickly? The images that come down to us are powerful. as the Honorable Consul had mentioned, there are no shortage of images and imitations and emulators of Alexander among European monarchs. Two of my favorite is our Alexander I of Russia. Not only the name, but he himself envisioned himself as an Alexander, posturing that he would march to India with his Cossacks and serf armies, like Alexander, burst into India and kick the British out. This is the beginning of the so-called Great Game. Another favorite of mine is Charles XII of Sweden, who was the Alexander of the North, until he ran into the Russian army at Poltava, and then he wasn't the Alexander of the North anymore. And you could just multiply the images and the examples of these types of emulation. Furthermore, as was mentioned, he is, and my dear friend Eugene Borza, to whom I owe many of the references here, Eugene Borza, who's devoted his life to studying Greek history and the emergence of Macedon and the role of Philip and Alexander, he collected references of Alexander in pop culture, and he is the one that ran what do you call them, polls, time and time again, opinion polls, in that indisputable arbiter of American pop culture, the shopping mall, where people were a little vague on the details and didn't quite know the chronology, but time and time again it shows that Alexander is the most recognized secular figure in history, We've got Buddha and Jesus and several others ahead of him, bar none. Which is extraordinary, is this king who had died so many centuries ago, over 23 centuries ago, is still recognized, and you get references. Trump Towers, until recently, the most opulent, splendid apartment is the Alexander the Great suite, with gold faucets and everything else to go with it. There is references in a physics article read that this breakthrough in black holes is the Alexander the Great achievement in physics. Don't question the grammar too much, but it does convey the power of these images. And Hollywood has tried to capitalize on it, and unfortunately hasn't done particularly well. There are two epic movies out there made by American movie makers. I actually think the one done in 1956, the Rosen film with Richard Burton and Frederick March as Philip of Macedon, the opening of the film is actually quite good in capturing both the affection and tensions between father and son. It does get to be quite jumbled later on in the film, especially when March is off the set. The one with Colin Farrell, that's come through in a number of iterations, well, I took my seminar on Alexander the Great to it. I bought them lots of popcorn, and it was good because otherwise they would have hanged me, because their immediate reaction is, what was that all about? And I think one of the problems, and this is going to come up with understanding scholarly opinions in recent years, one of the problems that Oliver Stone had is he never came to terms of who was Alexander. And to understand Alexander, I would insist you really have to understand the Iliad, you have to understand Achilles, you have to understand how classical Greek education was based on emulation of great heroes, arete, the great bravery, and that never got into the film. And it's unfortunate because there were some really brilliant sets that produced on it, and later on, if in question and answer or at the reception, I'll be glad to magnify my thoughts on it. I think the reason the films in part fail is you can't put Alexander's career in 2 hours. It has to be, in my opinion, a mini-series, at least 3 years in running, and I'm waiting for the contract to act as the historical consultant, 2% of the gross. I tell my students, go for the gross, not the net, because you never get anything out of the net, but as yet, no one is biting. Okay. Well, this raises a question. The popular perception to this day is of a great heroic king. Whether it is successful or not on the great screen doesn't matter. Everyone recognizes the name. It is a name of accomplishment. It is a name of virtue. A name of it implies the highest hero. It also implies the young, conquering, clean-shaven hero on the horse. That image I show you at the start. This is a whole conception of what a hero is supposed to look like. And there was never an objective history on Alexander. Always he was a figure of controversy, sometimes contradictions. He was larger than life. What has come down to us is not a contemporary account of Alexander, but later accounts based on these contemporary accounts. We know that there was a fellow called Callisthenes of Olynthus. He was a great nephew of Aristotle. He accompanied Alexander on the expedition, and he was not known for his modesty. He said that if Alexander would live on in history, it would be because of his history, not Alexander's deeds. This, of course, got him into trouble with Alex later on. Ptolemy, this future king of Egypt, he wrote an account. He was an eyewitness to many of the events, particularly in Central Asia and India. He was a boyhood friend of Alexander. He had been reared with Alexander and Aristotle. Eumenes of Cardia, one of the most fascinating figures to come out of Alexander's inner circle. He was the Greek secretary of Alexander, and we believe he kept what was the daily royal journal. These sources were still well in existence and widely known down into the Roman age, probably well to the end of antiquity. Unfortunately, they have not come down to us. We have not yet located papyri from Egypt that could give us parts of these histories. On the other hand, we do have a rich set of sources, more than we have for most figures from ancient history. The two most important I list at the top are Arrian's account and Plutarch's biography. Arrian wrote, really, in my opinion, the best military account of Alexander. It's called the Anabasis, meaning the march up country. It connotes the same geographic area and achievement as the earlier Anabasis by Xenophon, who from 401-399 BC led the Greek mercenaries out of Asia Minor. He also gives us a summary of the voyage of Nearchus, that was the admiral of Alexander, in a work on the Indica, which has a lot of information about India, which only became available to the Greek world with Alexander's conquest. He was a Roman senator from the city of Nicomedia, which would today be in Turkey and Asia Minor. He was a friend of the Emperor Trajan, of the Emperor Hadrian. He served under the Emperor Trajan. He was a governor, and he could appreciate the military campaigns of Alexander through experience and learn from his campaigns. Clearly, he understood cavalry tactics based on what he learned from Alexander, and in my opinion, in reconstructing two of the battles of Alexander, he is by far the most trustworthy source. Plutarch, on the other hand, is a biographer, and he doesn't go into those details, but he is responsible for many of those anecdotes that were mentioned earlier. His interest was to draw out the character of the man, and Plutarch has a profound influence. In many ways, he creates Western biography. And Alexander's biography is one of the greatest. It is in that biography that he actually explains what is the task of the biographer, not to tell every event, but actually sometimes to report a chance comment or an anecdote, something that illuminates why this character, why this person is so important that we can learn from. And he is a moral philosopher, he's unashamedly so, and Plutarch's Lives of the Noble Greeks and Romans was the most widely read book in early America up until the Civil War, with the exception of the King James Bible. Everyone knew the great stories of these Romans and Greeks. Both of those sources have a very favorable view of Alexander. They do criticize him at times. They're not panegyric. And Plutarch himself goes through and notes several of the darker moments in Alexander's career. The killing of Clitus in a drunken brawl, the ordering of the execution of Parmenion. But on the whole, they see him in a favorable light. We have three other sources. The third and the fifth represent Latin accounts. One is a very brief account, a summary, sign of, I guess I'm showing my age. It's the Reader's Digest, actually, for Romans who don't want to spend too much time reading. It's Justin's Epitome. Curtius Rufus's account in Latin from the 1st century. And then this work by Diodorus Siculus, who's writing a universal history of 40 books, in which one entire book is devoted to Alexander, books book 17. And there you get a lot of hostile traditions that have come to us from Diodorus. We're not quite sure of all the sources, but ultimately they trace back to the issue of Callisthenes of Olynthus, who was seen as a great philosopher and historian who had been arrested and died somehow, either through mistreatment or maybe execution, some 7 or 8 months later. Well, these are the sources that build our perceptions. Plutarch's anecdotes, the training of Bucephalus. When the young Alexander realized the horse was afraid of his shadow, he turned the horse in such a way he did not see the shadow and broke this magnificent horse. And his father just burst out in admiration and said, "My son, you must find other kingdoms when you grow older, because Macedon cannot contain you." It is the story of the Gordian knot, and above all, my favorite story, which is one of the best anecdotes of leadership, in the Gedrosian desert, as the army is returning to Babylon from the conquest in India, and they run short of water, and some water is found and brought to him in a flask while his army is dying of thirst, and Alexander sees his soldiers, and he takes the flask and pours it out on the ground. "I will drink after they drink." And the army got up and moved. These are the anecdotes that have come down to us through Plutarch and Arrian. And it led to, in the earlier 20th century, accounts that saw Alexander in a very favorable light. One of the most popular was the middle one there, we call him W.W. Tarn, a wonderful Victorian gentleman who wrote a very romantic and heroic account of Alexander. He goes a little too far at times, and you get the feeling with Tarn that, you know, Alexander is one of those chaps who, he just doesn't do those things because it's not cricket. But it's still a very good account in its supplementary studies. I put in Sir Mark Aurel Stein, who is one of the great archaeologists and followed Alexander's track in India, and the account there is cited by many historians, seldom read. But Stein, he's the man who actually excavated the Buddhist text from Dunhuang in the Tarim Basin. He's an extraordinary naturalized Englishman. He's born of a Jewish family in Budapest. Stein gained an appreciation of Alexander because he saw the terrain over which his army was operating. And he could identify these sites. He knew Northwest India. He had served there. The best account, in many ways, is Ulrich Wilken, the German scholar. His work is still available in translation. And Wilken is able to put Alexander's career in its retrospect and legacy better than anyone else. And these are the images of Alexander that I learned when I was an undergraduate studying, when I grew up reading about Alexander and his great battles, and it very much shaped my opinion. But the images have changed among the scholars in the last 60 years. Part of it is our own changing view of the sources, but really it has a lot to do with the impact of the Second World War. Already this issue was raised by Schackermeyer's work, Alexander der Grosse, in Ingenium und Macht, Alexander the Great, Genius and Power, where Alexander shifts from a great hero emulating Achilles to a great conqueror grasping for power. And Schackermeyer is writing under the shadow of the Second World War in Nazi Germany. And that image has been amplified in the last 50 years by a number of scholars, and I list 3 of them. All of them, well, 2 of them are now deceased, all of them would probably be in the camp. Let's make them Alexander III. Ernst Badian's work on Alexander and the Loneliness of Power, a very important essay where he outlines the tough politics of the Macedonian court, and Alexander is absolutely ruthless in removing opponents. Maxwell O'Brien's work, Alexander is an alcoholic battling with his own demons, and this is based on reports of the drunken brawl that he had with Clitus. And above all, A.B. Bosworth, who wrote some very important works, edited Arrian, and has in effect seen Alexander as a great megalomaniac committing genocide in India and Iran. And there are other types of opinions on this, but these are 3 of the most important should you want to follow it out. Why this change? why such a dramatic change in the last several generations? And as I said, I have a very good friend, she's now retired, an accomplished Greek historian, who's very insistent when we speak about he's Alexander III, and I'm very insistent, no, he's Alexander the Great, and we're still friends. Well, there's four things we can look at that support that new view. One of them is the dad, Philip II. Philip II is largely known through the orations of Demosthenes in Athens, who absolutely despised Philip as suppressing Athenian hegemony as well as Greek freedom. And Philip took Amphipolis away from the Athenians, which they felt was theirs. They actually hadn't controlled it since 424, but that doesn't matter. And we largely knew of Philip through the orations of Demosthenes. Well, in the 1970s and 80s were breakthroughs in understanding Philip. There was the archaeology going on in North Greece, and the achievement of Philip was recognized. Philip II, who unfortunately has the misfortune, really, of being followed by a son called the Great, is labeled Philip II and remembered as the father of Alexander the Great. I always recommend my students not to have that situation. Do not have an offspring who's known as the Great, because you're going to be forgotten. And I often give the trick question: who is Constantius I, Frederick William, and Ethelwulf? We all look at me blankly. Well, those are respectively the father of Constantine the Great, Frederick the Great, and Alfred the Great. All very capable rulers, but no one remembers it. Philip may well deserve the title Great. This is the extent of his power at his death in 336 BC. He had ended interstate war in the Greek world. He had allied with the Greek states, and the kingdom of Macedon was vastly expanded, and he was preparing an invasion of the Persian Empire. We don't know what Philip had in mind. Probably the best guess is he intended to conquer Asia Minor, west of the Taurus, and bring that under control and colonize it. I doubt he intended to overthrow the entire Persian Empire. Philip is much better known for his diplomacy and duplicity. He's right up there with Odysseus on that. And rather than his conquest, we do know of only one of his great battles, Chaeronea. The rest of his battles we don't really know in detail, and it's difficult to judge him militarily against the sun. He did, however, carry out very important achievements. He reformed the army. He literally had to carry out a social revolution and keep control of it to create a new Macedonian army and a new way of war. That is, the Macedonian phalanx would pin the opponent, the cavalry would encircle and destroy. It is a classic battle of annihilation. It probably is Philip's creation. He also brought in engineers and logistics people, which would enable Alexander to move that army so quickly across Asia. And he had superb generals, all of them who served the sun. Parmenio in particular, who went with him in Asia, Antipater, who governed in Asia Minor, Macedon, and Antigonus, who governed in Asia Minor. And this is a portrait of Philip that has come out of the excavations at Vergina. Everyone's convinced it's a contemporary portrait of Philip. Macedon, it was probably some kind of furniture decoration, and the furniture had disintegrated. Well, my point is, yes, it's true. Without Philip, there would have been no Alexander. On the other hand, awarding Philip the title Great doesn't necessitate that you take the title away from the son. And that is an argument that I've sometimes made with colleagues on that. I have a dear friend who's arguing even more. Well, no, Alexander inherited the army. He also inherited the officers and the generals. And the invasion of Asia was a collective effort by the Macedonian army, which gets lost in the accounts of Arrian and Plutarch, who are focusing on the king. And he could go so far as to say that Parmenio was essential, that Parmenio and the officers below Parmenio advised Alexander, and that there were repeated councils of war before the great battles. And so what in effect you're saying is that Alexander's achievements may belong to someone else. So, well, that is an issue that raises his military ability. And we could go into a great deal about a lot of his battles. He fought 23 major engagements without a single defeat. Under every condition imaginable in his age. Sieges, wars of pacification, 4 great battles that are still studied for strategy and tactics, even today at places like West Point. It is difficult to see how a war like that, achievement like that, could be done in 8 years simply by a committee. Most of us are professional people. We have dealt with committees, right? What happens at committees? Usually a collective opinion that makes no sense because it incorporates everyone's idea and a resolution to adjourn and have yet another committee meeting. I do not see a committee leaving that army almost 15,000 miles across the continent of Western Asia. It could be demonstrated by one of his greatest battles, the Hydaspes, one that's not well known, and we don't even know the precise location because it was fought in India. The Hydaspes is today the Yellow. It's one of the tributaries of the Indus in the Punjab, the land of the 5 rivers. Alexander had moved his army up to the Hydaspes, and the local king, Porus, with an army that was probably only slightly smaller, but had an advantage of having somewhere between 85 and 200 elephants, which is an advantage. These are dangerous creatures if you've not fought them before. Alexander is stopped by the river, and the monsoons are arriving, and the river is rising. Porus was pretty confident that Alexander would not attempt a crossing, and that crossing could be repelled by the elephants in his army, and he would take a severe beating, and so Alexander would retire. Alexander always accepted a challenge, and he couldn't afford Porus to not be defeated because it would look not very good among his various allies in northern India, the states that had come over to his side. None of Philip's generals are here now. Philip's generals are all gone. His second in command is a man named Crowderus, who was promoted due to his qualifications during the campaign. And what Alexander does is his most extraordinary strategic deception. He pretends that he's going to retire. He sends spies across, supposed deserters, giving all sorts of disinformation, the sort of stuff that the internet loves today. Crowderus also sends patrols up the river as if they're going to cross, especially at night, making all sorts of noise. Porus leads part of his army, and this goes on for a couple of weeks, and Porus just gets bored. Alexander is just posturing, and he's going to probably retire, and he stopped responding to these feints. As soon as Alexander knew that, he was ready to move. On an evening, probably right after dusk, he left about half of the army in the camp opposite Porus with instructions to cross when he heard the sound of battle. He moved his army north along the river. He had boats pre-positioned, and he crossed in 2 groups, some 5,000 cavalry and probably about 15,000 infantry at night. One of the crossings, they actually missed the bank and landed on an island and realized, oh, this is a mistake, we got to keep going. They were doing this in a high wind and the beginning of the monsoons, and as dawn broke, the army reassembled on the east bank of the river. He gave them about an hour's rest and ordered them to march south to engage the army of Porus. He was afraid that they would have been detected. They were not. Porus learned it too late. Porus moved his army to face Alexander, and a great battle was fought. This is a reconstruction by J.F.C. Fuller, as I think has the superior interpretation. You can see at the top that Alexander's army is marching from line of battle, moves into position. Alexander, through a clever cavalry maneuver, lures the Indian cavalry out, destroys it, and then flanks it. The Macedonians close and drive the elephants on top of the Indian army. They had been training with elephants with their allies. Now, it sounds also very simple, but that army has been in motion 17 hours before it engaged in battle. They had been moving at dusk. They had crossed a very difficult crossing. It's already the beginning of the monsoon weather, and if you've ever been there in India, it's overcast, damp, and drizzling with sudden violent outbursts of rain. And it's one thing to look at elephants and say, this is what you do when an elephant comes to you, as opposed to facing 200 of those beasts charging at you. and you do not have a helicopter or a high-powered rifle to stop or get away. It is amazing that this had been accomplished. And again, a victory like this would require a genius, a man to figure out the strategy, a man to march it up there, move him across. To be sure, he owed that army to Philip. He owed that discipline to Philip. But Alexander accomplished achievements with that army that Philip could never have dreamed of in his wildest dreams. And on that score, I would say that the argument that his achievements militarily should be shared or somehow diminished just doesn't stand up. Another criticism is Alexander the Tyrant. This is a favorite of academics. You know, we all are autocrats in our classes, so this is instinctive to us, myself included. One is a series of conspiracies and executions, another are the so-called mutinies, and then certain massacres that have sometimes been called genocides, both the destruction of Thebes as well as several cities in India. Without going into too much detail, these are individual incidents that are very, very difficult to add up as some kind of dictatorial repression. And it would also require you to do certain leaps of logic as to whether these conspiracies were really being masterminded by Alexander to crush the opposition. The execution of Philotas is one. He was executed because he failed to report a conspiracy to Alexander, and if we are to believe the sources, Alexander was very, very reluctant to order his execution, but he was pressed by his generals, some of them rivals, and jealous of Philotas, and he relented, probably regretted it later. When he killed Philotas, he had to order the execution of his father, Parmenio, who held a strategic position some 400 miles to the west, not one of Alexander's better days. Nonetheless, does that qualify him for the word tyrant as some kind of immoral figure, and therefore he loses his title. The others are even more dubious. Clitus, he got into a drunken brawl and killed him. And that was a shock to him. He went into grief, and you can either say it's feigned or it was sincere, depending on how you want to read the source. The mutinies themselves were hardly mutinies. One was a sit-down strike. The army was exhausted. Alexander relented, moved his army back. The other was a protest. We're losing you, Alexander. Are we still your Macedonians? And he was able to spell it and call them back to their sense of a duty. The so-called massacres, those were the rules of war, and in all instances, those cities were given a chance to surrender on terms. And the rules of war are harsh by our standards, but once a city refused and resisted, it was the conqueror's will to do as he wished. And in each case, they made examples which caused the surrenders of the surrounding areas. And so, to build him up as a megalomaniacal tyrant, to build him up to the level of a Hitlerian figure, you have to come with that preconception and read it through the sources. I prefer to read what the sources tell us. And if there's a problem, it's probably my problem. And I've been humbled by spending so much of my life reading these ancient languages, Greek and Latin. And if I'm going to go against those texts, I better have a damn good reason. As my dear friend Thomas Martin says, the ancients weren't stupid. Usually the problem is ours. We don't have enough information to understand what they're saying. Another way of looking at Alexander is to hold him up for the question of statesman and administrator. This would be the fact that he conquered this empire so rapidly in 8 years. 6 years the Persian Empire, add 2 years for India and southwest Pakistan. And it was too much. He had too many jobs to play. I always say 5, King of Macedon, Supreme Commander of the League of Corinth, Pharaoh of Egypt, that's easier, the god Amun-Ra. I like that job. Lord of Asia, and you could also throw in Maharaja of the Indian kings. Well, it's often been pointed out that it was easier to conquer this empire than to administer it. That for all of his military genius, he would somehow fail as a states builder, a statesman, or an administrator. And some would say, it's a harsh judgment, but there's some truth to it, that he died at the proper point at age 32, or in his 33rd year to be more accurate, and he didn't have to face the problem of running this heterogeneous empire, which split up after his death. He had received some criticisms for his adaptation of court ceremony, for his use of Persians to govern as satraps or governors in the Iranian provinces, for his marriage into the Persian royal family, for what has sometimes been called in German a fusion policy that is trying to intermarry the Macedonians and Iranians. Furthermore, there was no succession. When he died, there was a son who was regarded as illegitimate, quite young, known as Heracles, and a son to be born. There was a half-brother who was a half-wit, Philip Aridaeus, a sister and a half-sister, and of course the indomitable Olympias, one of the most remarkable queens of Macedon. And just as a aside, for those who don't know the anecdote, in the Wars of the Successors, she was one of the few to champion the interest of the posthumous son of Alexander, quite generously. It was her grandson. And she invaded Macedon from Epirus, and the Macedonians go out to march her, and she brings out the Epirotes. And they're all in favor of the half-brother, the half-wit, who's controlled by his wife Eurydice. And Olympias apparently marches into the intervening ground between the two armies, rents her chiton and beats her breasts and yells to the Macedonians, "Dare you oppose the mother of Alexander?" And the Macedonians say, "No way," and they go over to her. But other than that anecdote, there is no male heir to step in and take over, and it is divided among the so-called Diadochoi, the successors, who carve out their own kingdoms. Well, does that mean he's not the great? That he failed to leave a political legacy, that it divided? It divided into those 5 constituent parts I just said. One thing about that is the Diadochoi themselves were men of extraordinary ability. Seleucus, Ptolemy, Lysimachus, they're all first-rate generals. Many of them went on to become kings. And it's a testimony to Alexander that they had served him and that he kept them focused on conquering the empire when they were also ambitious and generally jealous of each other. And I would judge someone's ability by the people that surround and serve him or her. And on that score, Alexander gets an A+. Another important point about this state building is that the empire itself, while it would break up, many of the administrative measures necessary to run the different parts were in effect done by the successors. Egypt was run in a way that built upon how Alexander had settled it. The big Asian domains, the Seleucid kings founded Greek cities, set up military colonies, promoted international trade. And all of these would have been measures we suspect Alexander would have used. And again, we're only seeing Alexander's efforts to run this empire because in embryo because he died so soon. It is clear that he insisted on both loyalty and competence. He expected the provinces to be run fairly and efficiently and loyal to him. When he returned from India in 324, he fired, that is dismissed, Persians, Macedonians, Greeks, whoever they were, who had failed to accomplish their job. And some of them quit and fled west to Athens to engineer some problems. Purpose. So it's hard to judge that it would be inevitable that this empire would break up if Alexander had ruled for another 20 years and had left heirs. I'm not sure that's necessarily inevitable. We won't know. But I don't know if that's a fair criticism either. Let's just end this with, if this is so, well, who are other people who are called greats? Constantine the Great. He created the Christian Empire. He's a state builder. Rome took a turning point. From Augustus to Constantine is one empire, Constantine on is another. That is indisputable. On the other hand, what was Constantine's military record? Well, he beat up some other Roman commanders, largely by deceiving them. He doesn't have anything of the military record of Elias. Alfred the Great, the only king in England to get the name Great, he built the Kingdom of England. On the other hand, he started off his career with a defeat at the hands of the Vikings and a buyout. It's called Dango. Frederick the Great, who built Prussia, clearly a very fine general, although at his first battle in 1741, he and his cavalry were swept away, and the battle was won by his subordinates. He wasn't even there when they won it. And then my two favorites, Peter the Great, Catherine the Great, Peter, who establishes the Russian state, Catherine, who builds the Russian Empire, and of all those that I've just mentioned, of the five, she probably is one of the greatest of the strategists of the five. All five of these have received the name great because they built a political legacy. They had fundamentally changed their world. The Russian state now entered the European state system. It was built up to a world empire. Alfred the Great created the Kingdom of England at a time where disintegration was the norm in Western Europe. Frederick pulled one of the greatest stunts in history, that Prussia would be the Northern European power, not Sweden or Denmark, that everyone had thought before. And of course, Constantine, well, his impact is all important. He made Christianity the favored religion and forever changed Western civilization. But I would argue that maybe the political legacy of Alexander led to fragmentation, but he had changed the world just as rapidly and profoundly as those five. Political unity may not have been so important as the cultural, economic, and social order that followed. At the time that Alexander crossed into Asia Minor in 334 BC, the Greek world and the Near East had been in contact for centuries. And it was a question of what would the relationship be between these two worlds. The Greeks learned a great deal from the Near East. As Plato said, the Greeks never invented anything, but everything they took, they improved. Nonetheless, it was clear that Persia was in the ascendancy. Then suddenly, unexpectedly, decisively, in 8 years, that order was overthrown, and Alexander conquered this vast empire, and it was opened to the penetration of the Greeks, and Hellenism now became the dominant civilization for the next 1,000 years. And it would be embraced by the Parthians and the Romans, and it would go on to become the basis of the Christian civilization. And so I would submit that maybe the political legacy wasn't so important, and maybe these results were unintended or not expected. After all, Alexander was on a quest to equal his ancestors. But the results are decisive nonetheless. The military genius is clearly, without exception, the only one who would come in comparison would be Napoleon. And so, without Alexander, there would be no Hellenistic world. And without that world, there would have been no Julius Caesar, there would have been no Christ. And ladies and gentlemen, we wouldn't be here right now. Thank you. Besides failing eyes, I have hearing aids, and if I don't hear you, please bear with me. It's not from want of not listening. Okay. Are there any questions? Couldn't be back. Yes.
Earlier in the lecture, you had mentioned that you had some other lectures out on the great courses. Maybe come out.
Yeah.
Okay, so I've seen your great courses lecture on the ethnicity of the Macedonians, and in there, I think, if I understand it correctly, and correct me if I'm wrong, that the Macedonians and the Argead dynasty of Philip II and Alexander the Great, their Greekness and their claims to being Greek is dubious at best. Can you elaborate on it a little bit? Because it seems like the argument was based on...
The Argead dynasty in Alexander's time had been classified as Greek. That goes back to Alexander I, who was the king ruling at the time of Xerxes' invasion. And they allowed him to participate in the Olympic Games. And the court had officially adopted the Attic language in the time of King Archelaus. He ruled from 413 to 399 BC. The Macedonian population itself, it's unsure exactly what that language is that they speak. We have no inscriptions in the Macedonian language. What we have are Greek inscriptions, and they're from different dialects put up by the Greek, whatever his dialect was, you know, Ialic or Doric. The best guess linguistically is that Greeks, Macedonians, and Phrygians, these are people in Asia Minor, that's what Gordian is, go back to a common language somewhere in the Balkans in the early Bronze Age. And that the Greeks moved into the southern part of the peninsula, the Macedonians are behind, the Phrygians cross into Asia Minor at the end of the Bronze Age, and these languages diverged. There is the anecdote in Plutarch that when he's in his drunken rage with Clitus, he calls for the Hypaspist, his bodyguards, to arrest him, and we're told he speaks in the Macedonian tongue, Latte, in order to arrest Clitus, and also because he doesn't want the Greeks at court to understand. His uncharitable critics, like Demosthenes, would grant that the court is Greek. Alexander, in his aesthetics and language, would be Greek. His mother is classified as Greek. Philip is a mixed ancestry. The Macedonian kings are always marrying. Every time Philip has a campaign, he picks up another wife. And the one thing that the Greeks find strange about Macedon, it looks like a Homeric monarchy to them, actually, I suspect, is that there are no city-states, that there's a sense of a kingdom and a loyalty to the dynasty. There are a number of non-Macedonian, non-Greeks who are incorporated in the kingdom, especially in the northern regions, Phaeonians, Agrianians. They're in a category, they're part of the wider Greek world. They're in a category similar to the Carians, the Lydians, the people of the city of Segesta in Sicily. While they're not really ethnically Greek, they're so linked that somehow they're part of this. And eventually, for instance, Segesta, which is a non-Greek city, actually wins rights of Isopolitelia with some of the Siciliot, that is, the Greek cities. So, yeah, they're not quite Greeks. Politically, they're not at all of the city-state order. On the other hand, they become Hellenized as a result of Philip and Alexander's conquests. By, I suspect, the mid-3rd century BC, Koine Greek has displaced Macedonia. We don't know what happened to that language, it just disappeared. So, yeah, technically, yeah, they're not classified as Greeks, and as Herodotus would say, common altars, common gods, common blood. But the royal family was accepted as Greek, and the court was accepted as Greek. Someone like Socrates, the Pan-Hellenist in Athens, would write his letter to Philip as a Greek. Please end the fighting among us and lead us to a war in Asia. So they're in this strange intermediate zone as part of the Greek world, is how I would put it. Does that answer your question?
So if the Macedonian monarchy does not make it Greek, it's not a city-state like Athens or Thebes.
What was that?
If the Macedonians having a monarchy does not make it Greek politically, like Athens or Thebes.
Yeah, that gets to a political division, yeah.
But what about Sparta?
There are kings in the Greek world. The Cypriot cities have kings that are a continuation of the Mycenaean monarchs. The Epirotes have kings, tribal kings. They're Greek. So that's part of the difference. Demosthenes opposes him because he's a monarch. That's what he really hates. He sees, if we fall under Macedonian control, forget the democracy, and Athens goes second place. That's the basis of his opposition.
Professor,
Yeah.
thank you for a magnificent, illuminating lecture. Looking at the primary sources, as you outlined them earlier on, at the risk of betraying some pop culture here,
Oh, please, I want the reference.
can you form a view, educated a guess as it might be, as to how he died?
What was that?
How did he die, in your view?
I mean, the conspiracy theories are all over the place. He was very badly wounded in India, nearly killed. There's different names of the city of the Malay, the city of the Brahmins. He did recover after convalescing and moved down the Indus and led the army back. His friend Hephaestion had died, his best friend, and I think he suffered real grief from that. And taking those two, along with some kind of illness he had contracted by going into Babylon, which is, again, a swamp area, all of those factors together killed him. Now, there's always rumors of poison, or as, what's his name, Mitchell Ryan would argue that he drank himself to death. There was heavy drinking in the Macedonian court, but this symposium was well within the limits of what was accepted in the Hellenic court. And in fact, the Macedonians are really imitating the Greeks on this. There's a very powerful embracing of Greek aesthetics and social living, more or less, starting in the 5th and 4th century. You see, and they're looking at Athens, for example. It also explains why Philip gives Athens a pass time and time again, because he does recognize the position of Athens. It is the cultural fountain of his world. So my position would be it would be a combination of factors that led to his death. And again, it was totally unexpected. But you have to remember, we're living in a world without modern science. You can be healthy and strapping one day, and then you get an infection and you're gone. Just look at the difference between World War I casualties and World War II casualties. Your chances of recovering increase astronomically because of penicillin. So I don't see the conspiracy. I'm always dubious of conspiracy theories. Now, he is reputedly say, to whom do you leave it? I leave it to the strongest. That's probably Ptolemy's editorial remark. But there was no question that it should stay within the family.